Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dill, one of the more popular conversations that we have in all of college football. Who's the number one team in the country after 3 weeks? Obviously, the AP poll bumps up Texas to the number one spot. And I think we're sitting here saying, not necessarily sold. I'm not necessarily saying Texas ain't the number one team in the country, but I think this is a conversation to be had. And I think there's only one way to kind of settle this. Let's go through the rosters. Let's talk about what we've seen from both Georgia and Texas. And quite frankly, Ohio State probably has a conversation to be in this discussion as well. That being said, we haven't really seen Ohio State play a team where we can get a really good sense. We can have that good sense for Georgia and Texas. They've obviously played some big time football games. Fired up to get into this one. Before we do, and as always, most importantly here, whether you're a Georgia fan, whether you're a Texas fan, whether you're just a college football fan, would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. Dill, I think there's legitimate arguments to both sides of this conversation. So let it fly in the comment section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And Dill, I want to talk about something that before we get into the roster, right? Both of these rosters are extremely talented, littered with NFL dudes. I want to start with the culture of both of these programs. Now, you look at Georgia, you can say what you want about the off the field stuff. From a college football winning culture perspective, they've been the gold standard for the last couple of years, right? I think there's a really good argument. They've been the best team in the country for the last 3 years. What really stands out to me is that's probably the most improved aspect of Texas since Coach Sark has taken over. They've always had talent. I think they've really gotten the talent along the lines of scrimmage, which certainly has helped winning football games on Saturdays. That being said, the energy and vibes around this Texas program, I think, are night and day from when Coach Sark first took over Texas. You talk about one of those teams that just seemingly developing that winning culture. And as Michigan fans, we experienced it firsthand week 2. Dill, I think Texas is kind of getting there from a culture and coaching standpoint.
And even like early in Sark's tenure, there were a lot of games that they were losing that they shouldn't have lost.
Yeah.
I think he kind of felt that, but I think you're right. As he's gotten his guys through the program, that offensive line class, that group that kind of started with him and has been with him through this, and now is frankly kind of leading the charge, if you will, into this new era, I think is almost emblematic of what's kind of changed, because you knew Sark could call a good offense. He was a good offensive mind. He's always been a good offensive mind. It was whether he was going to put a physical brand of football on the field and be really, really dominant in the way he should be when you're coaching at a place like Texas. And again, I think you see how much better the defenses have gotten, how much more physical they are, how much better they tackle. You see how much better this offensive line's gotten as they've grown together from freshmen to now juniors and seniors. They've gotten really, really good. So I think, again, a guy who's really built that program up in the way I think it was needed for the SEC as he kind of embarks on that.
And I think two other, or at least one other thing that's worth noting from a coaching culture standpoint, I think Coach Sark has done a really good job hiring around him. Kirby Smart's always done that. Like, you look at what's made Nick Saban, Kirby Smart such elite head coaches for such a long time, the ability to make good hires and obviously replace those good hires with more good hires. I think Coach Sark is doing a very similar thing. You look at the coaching staffs for both of these programs, say it's really impressive. Now, I want to start the conversation, Dill, with the offensive line. And you kind of noted at the jump, one of the things that has changed for Texas, why they're a legit national title contender the last couple of years, it really starts with what they've done along the lines of scrimmage. We'll get into what offensive line we think is better, which I think is a legitimate conversation that we might need to have. But I think what stands out to me the most, look at both of these rosters. Is there a single transfer portal addition
I was
on
going
the
to say the
offensive
same
line?
thing, and you see these teams trying to build it that way. Again, Georgia, Texas, they use the transfer portal. They augment their roster with it. They're not like Clemson and Dabo Swinney where they like shun it in a sense, but they don't use it to build the meat and potatoes of those football teams. And I think you're so right to point out that, these are just homegrown, developed offensive lines that have played together for forever, it feels like, and just are in sync and really, really dominant units.
So I'll put you on the hot seat then. So I did want to just point that out. You're taking an offensive lineman tomorrow, or an offensive line tomorrow, to win a college football game. What offensive line are you taking, Dill? You go and ask me this before the 2024 season, it's a no-brainer. The answer was Georgia. Now, that answer might still be Georgia for me. I'm going to answer this question second. After what I saw from Texas, really just handling the Michigan defensive line that I think is filled with NFL caliber dudes, I think this is a conversation because I think you're looking at two of the best offensive lines that we see in the country.
Yeah, no, I think in fairness to the Georgia offensive line, they're probably leaned on a little bit more heavily than the Texas offensive line. I
Fair.
think still, like you look, Texas won that game through the air for the most part against Michigan.
Yep.
It's not like they were asked to bludgeon and beat that Michigan off the defensive line up, but they did a really, really good job in pass protection. That's what they were asked to do. And that offense put up a zillion points on a really good Michigan defense. And then you look at Georgia. I mean, they're asked kind of to be the engine of that team. That Georgia team wants to start with the run. They want to be able to be physical. And frankly, like against Clemson in the second half, they were able to put that on display against a really good front seven. But at the end of the day, against Kentucky, pretty much for that whole game, they struggled for the most part. And I was really, really surprised to see that, frankly. I think, again, Kentucky does for sure have a good defensive front. But for them to play that poorly, I'd say was a little like, I don't want to say it like has me out on Georgia by any stretch of the imagination, but right now you've seen just the consistency of Texas in doing what they need to do for that football team. I almost feel like I'd give them the slight edge.
I think you made a really good point. Like I almost feel like for pass protection purposes, I probably go Texas. If I want an offensive line that fits what Georgia wants to do, you probably do take Georgia because I think they are a little bit more physically
But
imposing.
they got to crank it up and play to their talent because they're a much better offensive line than what they put on.
And again, you go back to the Clemson game. I thought they handled Clemson pretty damn well, especially in the second half. So I think as college football fans, we're just used to like, all right, Georgia's going to dominate. Next topic, and you kind of pay attention to the 3 games where they'll play against like Alabama, Texas. I think at the end of the day, it's still a college football team. They're allowed to have bad performances. I think it's really close, but I think to highlight like why we're talking about 2 of these teams being at the top of college football, I think it really starts with this offensive line. But I think secondly, the quarterback position. Carson Beck, I was very vocal during this offseason. I thought he was the number 1 quarterback in the country. If you were to ask me to go win a college football game, what quarterback am I taking? I'm taking Carson Beck. Now, I know Quinn Ewers is dealing with some injuries. Quinn Ewers took the step from the small sample size that we've seen. They obviously have Arch Manning too. I think they have 2 of the best quarterback rooms that you see in the country as well. Now, what would maybe skew the conversation a little bit is the pass catchers. Because I look at Georgia's pass catchers and say, I do think there's an element of Georgia potentially missing guys like Brock and Ladd that Carson Beck, when he was uncomfortable, like he was against Kentucky, would kind of lean on. Now, Georgia's pass catch room is going to look a little bit different because it's going to be more diverse. It's going to be a little bit more spread out. My concern with Georgia is, do they have that true pass catcher one that Carson Beck can lean on like he's had in 2023 versus you look at Texas and say Isaiah Bond's kind of that guy. Gunnar Helm has emerged as one of the better tight ends in America. I probably do lean the pass catchers for Texas over Georgia throughout the first 3 weeks of the season.
And that is probably my fundamental concern with this Georgia team is, do they have that guy who has like elite chemistry with Carson Beck? Because I think you said it, like they had moments where they struggled last year, and then you'd have Brock Bowers just kind of pull them out of the fire and make things happen. And when they were struggling against an Auburn team that obviously they're far superior to, Brock Bowers could put that game on his shoulders and just kind of carry that team through it. I kind of look at the Kentucky game, a lot of things out of sync, just routes being a hair off. It just didn't seem like Carson Beck had that guy he could go to just consistently and make things happen. Obviously, you still see guys make plays. Colby Young making plays, back shoulder routes, being able to catch the ball in through traffic. You see guys like London Humphreys making plays. You see Arian Smith making plays, but they don't have that. I'm kind of with you. That is probably the one thing I'm looking at, because I think at the end of the day, the offensive line, I'm not as concerned about. I mean, yeah, they didn't play great against Kentucky, but I still know what they have. I really want to see what they have in terms of that guy who can, again, through the air, when they need things to happen, like who is the guy that they're going to be looking for? I thought it was going to be Lovett, but so far.
And it probably still is Dominic Lovett. but I think it's a far cry from Ladd and Brock and what we've seen from them the last couple of
No,
years.
I don't. I will say I don't know that we're totally ready to say Texas has that. I mean, they were cooking
Oh,
against Michigan. They were on against Michigan. They were playing really, really well. But I kind of wonder. I imagine Texas will get into a dogfight with a team they shouldn't be in a dogfight with. Almost every team does it at the end of the day. Like, who's their guy going to be? Again, they were flying around just like Georgia was in that second half. So we could have said, oh, yeah, London Humphreys, Colby Young, guys like Arian Smith. Like, we could have taken that from it. I do kind of want to see what Texas is going to do when they get in a dogfight because we haven't obviously seen it because they rolled through Michigan.
I think we know who it is though. Like I think it's Isaiah Bond and I think it's Gunnar Helm at the tight end spot. Who Gunnar Helm, like we were talking about how you replace JT Sanders. Like Gunnar Helm seems to be one of those safety blankets in this Texas offense. And I also think like you're going to get the continued emergence of a guy like Ryan Wingo, who is good enough to contribute in a meaningful way for Texas. Jonte Cook as a sophomore as well. I think there's just a little bit more firepower, and I think this conversation could change because again, you injected a lot of new faces. Like this was the Brock and Ladd show for Georgia in the passing attack the last 2 years. Give it a couple more weeks. Obviously, they got to bye this week. I think you'll see guys emerge. We kind of said it in the beginning. Maybe we're not too concerned because it's going to be kind of a committee approach. But at the end of the day, I think we both saw Saturday night against Kentucky. You kind of want a guy when your offense is not clicking that Brock can go to. I think the jury's still out. Running back position, I think is pretty clear. Georgia, obviously, like Jaden Blue's a dude, but you look at how deep Georgia's running back room is. Not only Trevor Etienne, but the emergence of a guy like Nate Frazier, who I need to get more. I would like to see get more.
Frankly, that's one thing I'm kind of interested in. Is I didn't think Etienne had his best game, frankly, against Kentucky in terms of what they need from him. And he hit his big plays. I know he's going to do that for them, but there were some times down and down out. And I'd really be interested to hear what the Georgia fans think about it. Like, was there points where you got to just see him run the ball more physically and knowing what Georgia wants to do in terms, like when something's not big there, like, do you want to see him be able to run through contact a little harder? Something like us Michigan fans, I feel like are constantly on Donovan Edwards about. I didn't think I'm not trying to say he had played a bad game, but I'm wondering if there's moments where you're almost like, well, we want him running the way guys like Zeus Smith or
Zamir White. Yeah, no, I'm a I do agree that maybe I don't know. I probably disagree. Like I think Trevor Etienne actually played a pretty damn good game against Kentucky and kind of showed up when they needed him to. But again, I think just from a depth standpoint and from a versatility standpoint, like Georgia's got more running backs that can do different things. I don't think, and again, the Texas fans were pounding the table for Jaden Blue all offseason before CJ Baxter even got hurt. They were spot on. Like
and
Jaden
he's
Blue,
really good for what they're going to
what
ask
they
him to
want to
do.
do. Agreed.
Setting him in space, he's a really good catcher of the ball out of the backfield and good working in the screen game that obviously Sark loves to go to. So, yeah, I'm kind of with you. I think for what they want to do now, do they miss certainly that physical presence on the inside at the running back room? Of course they do. But again, I think Jaden Blue for what their offense is probably going to be, I think is just fine.
So moving on,
fine. That's not the right word.
Moving on to the defense here. This is look. We said I think this Georgia defense is better, but we're gonna go kind of position by position because I think at right now you combined all the firepower that Texas has with the emergence of not only Arch but Quinn Ewers seemingly taking that step as well, and obviously Coach Sark running the offense. If you were to take an offense, I think we're both. I'll ask you this too. What offense are you taking here, Texas or Georgia?
I lean Texas because they've shown the ability to be really explosive, and I'm still waiting for Georgia. They had about like a quarter and a half against Clemson where they really I was like, this is a dangerous Georgia team. But again, to go a whole game pretty much against Kentucky, it's a good Kentucky team, but it's not on the caliber of an Alabama or a Tennessee, those type of squads, Texas even. You got to be able to do something. You got to be able to be explosive at least like a couple times.
And I also think that from a personnel standpoint, I think it's pretty dang close, but Coach Sark, it's really hard to bet against Coach Sark. And that's like an important conversation. Everyone wants to talk about players. Look, I think Mike Bobo is a solid offensive coordinator. I think he's taken probably too much heat for the bad performance against Kentucky. But Coach Sark said he might be the best in the game at calling an offense. So I'm going to lean Texas on offense. And obviously, we're going to lean Georgia on defense. But Dill, how close is it? Is probably the conversation now. A healthy Georgia, and they weren't even that healthy against Clemson. But when you have Mikael Williams firing on all cylinders, like that's such a hard defense to deal with. In the pass rush department, Dill, one thing that I'm really optimistic and where I think Georgia might have gotten better at is in the pass rush department, especially with the emergence of a guy like Jalen Walker, who has seemingly taken that step from just a role player to like a down-to-down player that Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann trust. That being said, you look at Texas and say, Dill, like someone like Colin Simmons, you add Trey Moore in the portal. Like again, Texas is not that far off on the defensive side of the football because that's becoming one of the better defenses in the country as well.
Yeah, and especially with the emergence of guys like Boughton. I mean, again, like that's still where my question lies. You obviously know Alfred Collins is awesome. Some of those transfer portals, I think, are good depth role players, but certainly not stars. I think the fact that Boughton's really starting to play really good football for them is huge because, again, you look, their edge play, I think, is on par, at least with Georgia, maybe not quite, but it's really, really close. That defensive tackle rotation, I think you certainly they came in with something to prove. And again, I think Boughton emerging and playing really well, it sures something up because I didn't think that transfer portal haul they were ever going to bring in was going to be good enough. Just like we talked about on the outset, that's a really hard position to rely on through the portal. So again, the fact that he's playing really well, Alfred Collins is good, and then their depth guys, the portal guys are kind of working in and giving them the minutes or snaps, let's say they need to. I think it's put them closer to Georgia. I still take Georgia's defensive line. I think it's much more complete, but Texas has acquitted themselves very nicely.
Yeah, they're closing the gap between Georgia in terms of on really both sides of the line of scrimmage. The back end, that's where I think you give in. Dill, you talk about Texas again, like getting better from last year. Like I think the secondary is massively improved. Now our Michigan Wolverines were really never going to test Texas in the back end, but from what you've seen from the other two games, like Colorado State threw for over 3,500 yards last year. They threw for 71 total yards against Texas. I get it's a group of 5 team, but that's a decent quarterback.
Yeah, I think the jury's still out on the secondary because it obviously struggled last year. Now you love the talent in that room. I mean, Makuba is really, really big time portal ad. I thought he played
Yes.
awesome against Michigan in terms of being able to cover tight ends, being able to be versatile and work in the slot, and also play that free safety role. And then obviously Muhammad, DJ Williams, super talented players who I think you'd like to see just kind of emerge as like our play to their talent on a very consistent basis. But I mean, at the end of the day, you're looking Georgia secondary is still probably
And especially with like the emergence of Malachi Starks playing that star position, I think it's the most important position on Georgia's defense. And I think it makes sense. Like, hey, I get Malachi Starks is going to play safety at the NFL level. If you have the opportunity to get your best player at the most important position, and he showed that he can do it at an extremely high level, I think that changes this Georgia defense. And then the emergence of KJ Bolden giving you the ability to kick Malachi Starks down to that star position, that matters a ton as well. Dill, I think we're taking the Georgia defense, probably taking the Texas offense right now. Now, I think the question is, and I'm going to ask you first, you can take the heat in the comment section, take a little heat off my back here. If these two teams, I'm not going to phrase it like that.
So we're going to know.
Yeah, they're going to meet. But like, let's kind of assume a little bit more full strength. I think Georgia and Texas, quite frankly, are working through some injuries. What team are you taking on neutral field here? Who's the best team in the country?
I still got the dogs, and it's tough. I know that. I mean, obviously, Texas, frankly, looked better through the first half of this or the first 3 games this season. But I look at when Georgia was kind of clicking on all cylinders in that second half of Clemson. That team, I feel like, is really, really hard for anyone to beat. And I also think there's part of me that, again, the way Georgia's kind of done it for the past couple of years, we've seen them struggle with teams like this before.
Yeah.
And just like we've seen Texas, we've seen big dog teams struggle with teams that they certainly should be beating up on a little bit. I don't think it's like time to overreact to that. Georgia's still been the creme de la creme of college football for the last 3 years. Until they get knocked off and something like starts to really change and shake up, I still got to lean them over Texas right now. But Texas is pretty clear, too, to me right now.
I think I agree. And again, Ohio State's in this conversation, but I kind of went into the year with 4 kind of elite teams that I thought were separated, and Oregon was kind of included in that group. And obviously I think Oregon's getting to that form, to be quite frank, with what we saw against Oregon State. but it was always Georgia, Ohio State, Texas. Now I think Texas jumps Ohio State, but more importantly, that gap in my mind between Georgia and Texas, it's closing.
And honestly, to me, it's Quinn Ewers. And Quinn Ewers, to me, I came in,
Yeah.
obviously liked what you saw from him, but to me, he always felt like a bit of a role player in a really, really talented Texas offense. That Michigan game I found very eye-opening. His ability to make plays, make things happen, and kind of be the engine, let's say, of that Texas team. And when they needed him on 3rd and long, he was converting. When they had pressure in his face, he was making things happen, evading it, and then getting the ball downfield. I think his playmaking ability is kind of caught up to where I think Carson Beck is, because you've seen Carson Beck make those type of plays. That's kind of his athleticism, his ability to create a little bit was probably what was separating the two of them. But Quinn Ewers, I think he's getting the ball out of his hands faster. I think he's making more plays. That to me is frankly his bridge the gap, because at the end of the day, Texas everywhere else aside from maybe in the secondary was always like kind of getting right to where Georgia.
Yeah, and to me, it's Quinn Ewers, but I also think this Texas team is just getting right in the locker room. And like that matters. Like that, like the again, I'm a vibes guy. Like the vibe and energy that you got from that Texas team to come into Ann Arbor. And I get Michigan maybe not as good as we thought they were, but to still just like shellac them and kind of have that energy of like, we think we're the best team in the country. I think that matters. And I think Coach Sark has done such a good job with the culture of that program that I can't wait for this football game. And again, the conversation is going to continue to change as we get more information and data on both of these teams. I think the conversation is certainly there. I'll take Georgia as well. I think both of these teams are kind of separating themselves along with Ohio State. We'll close it out there. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. Would love to hear from y'all in the comment section. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later.